Today we're honored to welcome Dr. Jess Armine to the show today. I'm very excited about this. He talks about some very important topics today because chronic disease is very prevalent. If you don't know someone who's dealing with this, I don't know where you are, right? Because if it's not you, it's someone else that you know for sure, someone that you love, your family members, your friends. And it doesn't have to be like that, right? We unfortunately live in a world where the deck is stacked against us, where it's very hard to be healthy, but should be the opposite, right? And getting to the base of these things, like the knowledge behind why we have these things and having understanding so we can actually navigate that in a skillful manner is of the utmost importance. This man has a lot of information and knowledge within that today, so we can actually take control of our health and our minds to live the life that we desire. So, how are you doing today, Dr. Armin?
I'm doing real well. You can call me Dr. Jess. That's what everybody calls me.
Dr. Jess, gotcha.
I don't know why, but about 20 years ago, they started with that. I didn't correct them. I'm like, fine. It's okay.
Yeah. All right. So I'm very curious to hear your story and how you got into wellness and basically like the inner workings of chronic illness.
No problem. Very happy to, chronic illness is where I live basically because my patients are, complex multifactorial chronic illnesses that haven't gotten success elsewhere. So that's where my practice is now. But I've been a healthcare provider for about 50 years, literally since 1975. I started out as an EMT in New York City and became one of the first paramedics. Kind of at the same time, I went to college for nursing and graduated in 1978 and became an emergency department nurse. Went into the military as a nurse and did mostly emergency, and I ended up as a head nurse of a coronary intensive care unit. So I was all in that acute care stuff, okay? Then I decided I wanted to be a doctor and was doing my prereqs for medical school and met a lot of medical doctors, and they hated what they did. Hated it. Okay, I'm like, okay. I met some chiropractors they really enjoyed. So I went to chiropractic school, graduated in 1986. I practiced standard chiropractic for a few years, but for me, it was a bit limiting. I love helping people, but it was limiting in the diagnostic end. I noticed that there were a lot of chronic illnesses I was running into, and I started learning about the broader concepts. What kicked me into gear was one of my children developed schizophrenia. And the medicines that they, being a good dad, I took him to the psychiatrist, the medicines they gave him made him a non-entity. What I mean is this very bright young man who read Dante's Inferno at 10 years of age for fun and explained it to me, became a person who sat on the couch and was doing this back and forth and couldn't think. So I decided that this disease was messing with the wrong daddy. And like anything else in life, when you say, I want to learn about this, Spirit says, okay, if you're serious about it, here's all the information. And I started learning and learning and learning. And the more that I developed expertise in certain areas, I was seeing more chronically ill patients. And I noticed that there was an area that was never considered significant and never treated. And this was like ubiquitous, like almost everybody. And that area was treating somebody at the cellular level. Because disease starts there. Mostly we treat the end results. You've got Hashimoto's, you've got rheumatoid arthritis, you have whatever it happens to be. And we treat it from that point of view. So we're treating kind of the end result, and we're not really treating the illness with a curative intent. You're treating or managing the symptoms. And the question in my mind was, well, if you're told you have a chronic illness, is that it? I wrestled with this, and I realized that chronic means permanent to them. Okay, and nobody's stupid. It's the way it's presented to you. Okay, so chronic is permanent, which it's not. Okay, and you start beginning to think that you are your disease. Okay, instead of saying I have XYZ, I am XYZ. And then if you look it up, you say, if I am an autistic person, I am somebody with OCD, I am somebody with Asperger's, I am somebody, instead of I have this, but the whole idea is that it's not being cured, it's being managed. More often than not, especially in the neuropsychiatric realm, they don't believe that there is or are root causes that can create this condition. downstream from the root causes. So believe it or not, that's where I started learning an awful lot of stuff. I actually developed a system of thinking called Bioindividualized medicine, which looked at the genetics, which I'm an expert in also, looked at the combination of, or the relationship between the nervous system, the immune system, and the hormone system. It's called neuroendoimmunology, which I have a certification in, and this constant communication there, looking at mitochondrial function, which is inherent. And then what most people don't look at is the patency of the cell membranes, because when they're leaky, if you will, okay, nothing's going to work well. So things like fatigue, anxiety, brain fog, insomnia, digestive problems, inflammation, are your body's attempts to communicate with you that things are out of balance. And we should listen to missed signals as opposed to suppressing them, as opposed to giving up on them, and realizing that most chronic illnesses, almost any you could name, okay, have a reason and are not only manageable, but for a lot of times, they can be reversed. Okay. How does one go about that? So let me tell you the process so that you realize that you haven't been, I'm going to say that you haven't been told the whole story, but I'm going to let you know that your medical doctors are not stupid, and they really do care. And they're frustrated too, by the way. They're frustrated that they can't, fix people. And I found that and again, they're not stupid. I have lots of allopathic or, traditional medical friends. They simply aren't exposed to this particular line of thinking. Okay. So root causes, okay. In autism, there are lots of root causes, but they ignore the fact that there are root causes. And when I get that argument, I'm saying, well, let me ask you a question. In 1970, the incidence of autism was 1 in 10,000 births. Now it's 1 in 34 births. Explain that. Our genes haven't changed. Okay. Our environment has changed a lot. The toxicity has. Maybe we should look there. What has that done? So if you have root causes, they damage a cell one of 3 categories. Dr. Robert Navio, MD, PhD, in 2013 wrote a paper called The Parameters of the Cell Danger Response. Okay, why is that important? Because when a cell is attacked, it becomes very dysfunctional. And normally, you can kill whatever it is and then get rid of it and just go along normally. But when it's multiple things, that particular dysfunction with the cell remains. So what are the categories? Toxins, which you might expect. It makes sense, right? That can injure a cell. Microbes, parasites, viruses, bacteria, and all the psychological, emotional, and spiritual traumas that we face. He proved on a scientific basis, which is the only thing acceptable to the medical profession, that those 3 areas in equal measure will interfere or injure a cell. Now, let's talk about like a bacteria. It gets into the cells, and that cell danger response basically says, hey, I'm going to cut it off. In other words, I'm not going to let it go. I'm going to make the inside of the cell inhospitable. In other words, more toxic and so forth. And guess what? It's going to die. We have released something called hypochlorous acid. Don't worry about the word. I say a big word, ignore it. Okay. Just ignore it because I just want you to get the concepts. The little nuances are not important for our discussion today, so that you understand the concept. So when that bug, if you will, okay, is neutralized, we have a bunch of mechanisms that reset or reboot the cell's function, and we go along normally. Now, this is a good example. You get strep throat and you feel terrible. You go to the doctor, they give you antibiotics. For a couple of days, you're like, you start getting better a little bit. And then there's that day where you turn the corner and you get better rapidly. That's when the cell danger response resolves itself. And normal cellular function takes over. And guess what? You start getting better and go about your life. Now, if you have multiple attacks, which happens a lot in this society because we have lots of toxins, we're exposed to a lot of microbes, and let's face it, we live in a high stress society, so the probability of psychological, spiritual, or emotional harm is pretty well there. Okay, that happens over time, multiple things, and the cell danger response does not resolve completely or doesn't resolve at all, and your ability to combat disease is lessened. This all happens within the mitochondria. What's the mitochondria? Everybody throws that term around, mitochondrial dysfunction. And well, remember at school where they drew the cell, okay? They put a little circle up there. That's the nucleus. That's the brain of the cell. Put a little dots in there. That's the cytoplasm. Then they drew something that looked like a racetrack and said, that's the mitochondria. That's your powerhouse. And they go on to something else, okay? They weren't lying. Your mitochondria is that organelle inside your cells that produces energy. The energy is called ATP. Don't worry about it. Adenosine triphosphate, for those scientifically minded among us. But let me tell you how important it is. You have 30 trillion cells in your body. And in each cell, you have between 200 and 2,000 mitochondria. You do the math. So you depend very heavily on their output of energy to run all your processes, which now allows your immune system to work, allows you to absorb what you eat, allows you to take what that is and turn it into what your body needs here and there, okay? So guess what? If your mitochondrial function drops, you become less and less able to combat disease and resolve it yourself. I'll give you an example. It's not on or off with the mitochondria, it's a percentage. So just to give you some idea, let's say normally you're producing 95% because your energy, your mitochondria are working well. So you're putting out the energy at 95%. You get the aforementioned strep throat. That'll drop to about 80%. But once the cell danger response is resolved, you go right back up to 95. But if you start getting other issues exposed to you, that percentage of energy begins to drop permanently. And let's say you get down to about 75%. Now, you can still live, you can still sit up and look at somebody, but you're just simply not able to fight disease. Now, what happens when that happens? Well, when you're not producing enough energy, the downstream effects are things like leaky gut syndrome. In other words, chronic inflammation. You're being assaulted by high levels of oxidative stress, and your ability to heal is impaired. So that simply gets worse. Everybody likes to talk genetics, okay? And people will ask, how come one person gets this and another person gets that, or it happens in a family but somebody doesn't get it? Genetic predisposition is literally that, a possibility. What makes it express? What makes it come out as an illness? Oxidative stress. If you can't produce enough energy to have your immune system work, and your ability to take in things like vitamins and minerals, which makes your biochemical processes work, if they slow down, and you have more and more oxidative stress, which has to be detoxified, but you're having trouble with it, wherever the glitch is in your system, whether it happens to be high levels of dopamine that may cause things like OCD or anxiety or paranoia or hallucinations, or it happens to be the precursor to rheumatoid arthritis or the precursor to Hashimoto's thyroiditis, that's the way it's going to express, to where the glitches are. But it's all based on oxidative stress. Now, you go see your medical doctor, and this has been set up, right? Remind you, I've been doing this 50 years, right? I saw the changeover. I saw them when they went from, for those who are my age group, I'm 69 years old. In my age group, everybody remembers Marcus Welby, MD, who's your quintessential general practitioner. Knew everything, sent you to a specialist when it was necessary. In that time frame, you would go to a specialist. They would barely talk to you. They say, I'll call your doctor. They would call your doctor who knew you since you were a baby. And then your doctor would call you and say, this is what the guy said, and this is what I think we should do. And that's who you listen to. We don't have that anymore. We don't have those guys who know you since you're a baby, okay, and knew your family and knew all the issues and were able to treat you very well. So what ended up happening is we went from the generalist to the specialist. This was happened in the 1970s, and the GP was ostracized. You're just a GP. Guess what? All right, you're the most necessary person. So when everybody became a specialist, there was nobody coordinating it. And then corporations took over, and they want productivity. So that's why you go see your doctor, and if you get 10 minutes of their time, you're lucky. And they're not doing it on purpose. They're not doing it to make money. They're doing it because they're forced to do it. Okay, they don't want to lose their license either. They're forced to do it. You notice that there's no more single doctors around. They're all in groups because the insurance is so difficult that they share a staff so that they're not spending all of their money and time on separate staff to go after the insurance, which makes it very difficult. They've been trained to listen to tests as being gods. And the fact is that why so many people are sick, even though they have normal labs, has to do with the laboratory ranges. Okay. We look at the ranges and say, ooh, it's normal. Not necessarily. If it's way down low and it's just a little tick into the normal range, it's still suboptimal. Okay. So most laboratory ranges tell you what's common, not necessarily what's optimal for your particular condition. Okay. And that's why you have to learn to look at patterns instead of isolated values and look at early warning signs. Okay. Nevertheless, since that model happened, their model of treating is, okay, if I take care of the root causes that I can find, the body will take care of itself. And that's simply not true. Dr. Navio again wrote a paper in 2018 and said in there, and I was surprised an MD said this, is that the treatment of acute care is very necessary. The identification of the issues and eradication is important. But when the parameters of acute care are utilized in chronic conditions, they're less effective and usually make things worse. When you have a chronic condition, all that's happened is whatever the root causes are that created those downstream effects, if they try and treat just the root causes, the dysfunctions and damages that have been done downstream have not been attended to. Okay, if you're just treating one pathway, you're giving thyroid replacement to somebody with Hashimoto's, you're not even considering how it got there. Hence autoimmune disease, which they say, oh, well, you have it and it stinks to be you, but we can manage it. They're not even thinking of the fact that, how did it get there? Well, it's genetic. Really? How come I didn't have it when I was a baby? My genes haven't changed since I was a baby. Matter of fact, those genes haven't changed in 10,000 years. Okay? Whatever you're born with, you're born with. How come illnesses come out at different times under different circumstances? How come people with the same messed up pathways, some people get it, some people don't? The BRCA2 gene that, everybody with a certain type of breast cancer, they looked at those people and said, oh, they have this particular allele or polymorphism or SNP in this particular gene. So if you remember, they were recommending to take away the target organs, the breasts, the uterus, the ovaries. Okay. But guess what? They didn't study the whole population and say, all these people have this particular problem with the BRCA2 gene. And why do these people have cancer and these people don't? Okay. And it came down to, and always comes down to, especially in cancer, the level of oxidative stress, which overcomes your immune system's ability to recognize an invader. Our cells mutate a lot, kind of what they do. All right. And normally your immune system says, hey, you don't belong here. Okay. Boom. Takes care of it. Okay. If it loses that ability, if there is a mutation that is compatible with your physiology, it'll take root and then start growing. Okay. That's the basis of cancer. Although, I'm making it very simplistic, but if that happens, then treating it becomes a very difficult thing because now it's entrenched and it's spread and stuff like that. So when you're looking at chronic illness, I want you to know very quickly that you're not broken. And guess what? there may be things that you can do that people have not looked at and say, okay, this can be made better. This can be treated. This can be treated where it started at the cellular level. A lot of people like to talk about the gut-brain axis, okay, where the gut influences mood. So things like anxiety, depression, and or happens to be a result of neurotransmitter imbalances, serotonin, dopamine, and stuff like that. What does that have to do with the gut? Well, remember I told you about that neuroendoimmunology? They're constantly talking. So a normal gut with a normal microbiome has a certain amount of signaling, messages it sends to and from the brain. When the gut microbiome or the gut issues become dysfunctional because of lots of reasons, it's sending the wrong signals. And that causes the brain to go, or the neurotransmitter systems to become dysfunctional also. It'll also affect your hormone system. Hormone replacement therapy is not always the answer. Fixing the physiology is. So in your gut, brain, they're always conversing. So, I gave a lecture last year at the Ultimate Hormones Conference, and my subject matter was, when you're doing everything right and the person's not getting better, where do you look? Okay? And you would look at the other areas like the neurotransmitters, like the immune system, because that may be causing it. Okay? What keeps us back in chronic illnesses? Things like chronic stress. This is a really high stress society. When I was a kid, on Sundays, there's only two things open: the church and the bakery. That's it. Okay? There were three channels, and you always hear these stories, 3 channels on the TV, and it's shut off at night and stuff like that. But now everything's 24/7. And with that, we have this incredibly fast-paced society that you have to keep up with. And that drains you, and it gives you less ability to fight disease. Processed foods, the more processed the food is, the less nutrient value it has. When you have a really busy schedule, you don't have time to cook. And the way they market is saying, hey, this is like homemade, and it's not. There's lots of preservatives in it, and it's tough. This also ends up in sleep deprivation. Lack of sleep is a major reason people are ill. Okay? Your inability to have restorative sleep will make you ill. Okay? We have a lot of environmental exposures that we didn't have before. There's more toxins out there that we have to deal with, things like organophosphates that they spray on the vegetables. And you talk about GMO versus non-GMO. Well, organophosphates, which are things like Roundup, that gives you a higher yield because it prevents some diseases, but it gets into the water table and you're drinking it. And it's not easy to filter that out, but that literally affects your mitochondrial function. So when you spray Roundup on a plant, like within a day it goes, the reason for that is it kills the mitochondrial function, so the plant can't produce energy either, and it just withers and dies. Okay? And we have a lot of, information overload, which I think, especially in America right now, unless you take a news vacation, you're worried about what's happening, what's going to happen. And, if you have a family especially, it's tough to live. You have to be real creative, but it's a lot of stress. And stress is not just in your head. It's that third circle of psychological, emotional, and spiritual traumas. The other thing that we're faced with these days is the results of COVID. COVID, especially if you had the vaccines, gave you something called a spike protein. That's that protein that goes into those receptors, the ACE2 receptors, and those receptors are all over the place. And believe it or not, it affects your mitochondrial function horribly. It's really interesting, because I was around during the pandemic, and since my practice is totally virtual, I did reasonably well because I was set up for it and other people weren't. Other doctors that had offices and stuff like that. But soon as we got tired of them scaring us with the variants, lambda, was really nonsense, because viruses do mutate, and they mutate to a less virulent form, because not even they don't even want to kill their hosts. Okay, so when they stopped doing the scare tactics, so you'd have more uh, more vaccines and this, that, and the other thing. All of a sudden, within a short period of time, like a couple of months, studies were coming out showing how the vaccines and specifically with the spike protein was causing all kinds of problems, even with the delivery system for the mRNA vaccines. And I'm like, they did those in 3 weeks? They knew about it beforehand. Okay. The spike protein is considered a toxin. And if it's fairly ubiquitous in your body and it's still on those receptors, you're going to find that you're going to have more fatigue. You're going to get illnesses easier, and any illnesses you have will take longer to heal. How do you know if this is a problem? If you weren't sick before the pandemic, whether you got the vaccines or not of COVID, because you're going to get it by shedding anyway, and you became ill, but you never got back to where you were, that's the effect of the spike protein. If you had conditions beforehand, and you either got COVID or got the vaccines or whatever, and during and after the pandemic, you became worse, but again, you never got back to your baseline, that's the effect of the spike protein. Sadly, it's been doing some very nasty things. The literature shows you this is more heart attacks, more cancer, more lung problems, infertility, and goes right along the gamut. Why is it like that? Because it affects your mitochondrial function, taking it from maybe that average of 75 if you have a chronic illness down to 50. Okay, there's no studies for this. I'm just giving you the ideas of how it works. Okay, so when you degrade the mitochondrial function even more, then whatever else is going on in your body where your body adapted or compensated can't compensate anymore, and then you see other illnesses come through. So the thing about chronic illness is you have to at least acknowledge the fact that chronic is not permanent. In admitting that to yourself, you can open up the possibility that maybe there's other things that need to be done or can be done. And many diagnoses are not diagnoses. What do I mean by that? A diagnosis should point to the root cause of a problem. So if you have a sore throat, that's a symptom, not a diagnosis. If you have strep throat, now I know why you have the sore throat. If you have a tendency to OCD, that's a list of symptoms. It doesn't tell you what's causing it. Well, in that area, they don't believe anything causes it. It's the roll of the cosmic dice, okay, which is untrue. You have an autoimmune disease, list of symptoms, lab tests and so forth. They don't even look for a root cause because they don't believe one exists, okay, as a result of something. So they're left to just treating the inflammation, and they'll do it with NSAIDs, then COX-2 inhibitors, then steroids, and then, biologics, which if you watch TV in America and the drug commercials and you see this new thing coming up for, rheumatoid arthritis or any of the immune problems, and you see all these people dancing around nicely, but if you close your eyes and listen, okay, they'll tell you that, people have died in their trials. If you have, it'll reduce your ability to fight infection. It's damping down your immune system with the presumption that your immune system is over functioning. That may or may not be true, but no one asks why. And there are reasons. So chronic illness is not as incurable as people think. Okay. And where does this all lie? I developed a way of looking at things that I teach other doctors all the time. There's no Jess Armine method out there. Okay. I took my knowledge and just, making sure the new generation has it. It has to do with the ability of giving the cells what they need to work. Leaky gut syndrome is usually involved. And the reason that that's important is because it's a major reason for increasing inflammation. It's one of the easier things to fix because, if we don't digest our foods, we create antigens that get through that membrane. And then the 80% of your immune system is along the gut. And your gut and your immune system works on that. The end result is inflammation. So it continues building and building and building. And looking at and actively treating the mitochondrial dysfunction, which when you're treating leaky gut, you're treating that also. And that's also paying attention to the cell membrane integrity, because your cell membranes are just not walls. All your receptors are in there. And, if you have a leaky gut, then you have most probably have a leaky blood-brain barrier. You have leaky cells. I wrote a book that's on Amazon called Leaky Gut, Leaky Cells, Leaky Brain. Okay, where I made all this stuff real understandable and colorful and stuff. One of my fortes is explaining complex things very simply, because that's the way I understand it. I think in cartoons. I love cartoons. Okay, so, and then if you get the physiology working the way it's supposed to, when it concerns infection, those bugs do not like a normal environment. They like an acidic environment. So same thing as if you have a fish tank. If the fish looks like it's sick, you don't treat the fish, you treat the water. Okay, guess what? If I treat the environment in the body, then your immune system can take over and do what it's supposed to be doing. And the environment is inhospitable for whatever bug you're talking about, makes it easier to destroy it and get rid of it permanently. So my methodology is to look at the function of the cells, hence the base. I call it foundational treatment. You may see it in the literature as terrain treatment or bioterrain treatment. My colleagues laughed at me for about 20 years when I was spouting this, and now all of a sudden they're, okay, we have to treat the terrain. I'm like, I wonder if you heard that before, and I don't care as long as you're doing it right and they're considering it, because that's the basis of disease. Now, should you treat whatever the problems are? Sure, absolutely. Okay, but if you don't treat the base, if you don't treat the cellular function, then everything you do out here is never going to work. You have an autistic child. They have things like brain balance and so forth, exercises. Lots of times they make things better, but they never last. Why? Because the inflammation, the neural inflammation in their brains has never been resolved. So it's doomed to fail. You correct that and then start retraining them. Then the treatment sticks, if you will. Okay, I've seen it many times. But it's a complex area. It's a quagmire, and people have individual ways that they do things and so forth, and giving the parents hope and taking a lot of money when they're not treating the base of it. So if you're having a chronic illness, some of the things you can do. You can prioritize your sleep. Okay, sleep is not laziness; it's biological maintenance. You need to sleep. That's where your healing happens. Okay, and if you're one of those people that can't get to sleep and you need melatonin, that's one indicator. Or you can get to sleep but you can't stay asleep, or you're a very light sleeper, you need to work with the practitioners to get that right. Simplest thing is stabilizing your blood sugar. You need to have adequate protein, and protein that you can digest. And you talk about processed foods. There's ultra processed foods, there's processed foods, and the things that are minimally processed. If you have to make choices, and I understand, it's an environment where, it's fast paced, and a lot of times you don't have the time to make, quote unquote healthy meals. Just pick minimally processed. By the way, if you have 3 meals a day, 21 meals a week, and you have 1 or 2 junky meals, don't worry about it. Don't get crazy. Don't be so, draconian. But make most of your meals making your best choices, okay? And more than that, listen to your body. Listen to the information that's coming in. You're not weak. You're not stupid. Everything that we associate with people who have chronic illnesses that are not obvious, like, being in a cast or something, all right? You have something that is being unrecognized, and it should be recognized. It's not your attitude. It's not anything that you've been accused of. Okay? It is a problem at the cellular level, and that's the usual suspect that hasn't been treated. Okay? So remember, health isn't the absence of disease, it's resilience. Okay? The ability of your body to adapt. Okay? And if you start thinking about it that way instead of disease management, if you understand that there's an area that can be looked at and be treated. And treating it has to be a complete thing, you know. I have a lot of people, oh, I treat leaky gut. How do you do that? I'm taking probiotics. Okay. There's no mucus layer, so where are they going to live? All right, there's lots of different things. Your body's not your enemy, which is what you think when you have chronic illness, okay? It's consistently working to protect you and communicate with you. So the sooner you stop fighting symptoms and start understanding them, the closer you're going to get to your own true healing. I see this all the time. I see somebody who's, one recent guy I had was, he was, I think, agoraphobia. He couldn't get out of the house. But before that, he was a very successful businessman. And when I took my history, which takes me an hour and a half, I found out that a lot of this stuff started when he was in fourth grade. I said, okay. And he started getting ADD, and just things got worse and worse and worse to the point that he couldn't function anymore. So I went back there and I said, well, what happened around fourth grade? And he said, he was talking about, what he was feeling. He said, something funny happened. I lost my taste for meat. I said, really? Which I raised 3 sons. Meat? Protein? The guys just said, hey, back up the cow, I'll cut my own piece off. Boys and protein. Okay. He lost his taste for protein. And I said, wow, there's a type of Lyme disease that will do that. Okay. It's called alpha-gal syndrome. Okay. And I said to myself, gee, we tested him. He's got Lyme disease. Neural Lyme for that man. He's 35. We're talking about 4 years of age. And that caused problems and made things worse and worse and worse throughout the years. And then he compensated very well until he couldn't. And that's when he crashed and couldn't leave the house. I started treating his base. Within weeks, he started brightening up. He's thinking better. He was able to go out. And yes, we're going to go, we're going to work with a couple of other doctors to get rid of the chronic Lyme. But all the things that his body needed to work, because by that time it's exhausted, I was pumping into him. And he started feeling better because I had that point of view. Plus, I don't like to leave stones unturned. So when I do a workup, okay, because I have the time. I'm not constrained to 10, 15 minutes with a patient. Okay, I will take the time because I can. And that's why I will take an hour and a half to figure out what's going on and correlating all the tests and doing whatever it's necessary to find out what the issue is or issues are and how they contributed to your present condition. Now that I've talked incessantly, got any questions, Anthony?
Man, that was awesome. Like, a lot of wisdom there, a lot of great information that we can utilize on life. Essentially, a lot of things stuck out, but in the beginning is like the medical system, right? It's like you mentioned how the doctors, like they're really not passionate about what they do because they're so stressed in a sense. Like they don't really like their job in a sense, but they really care, right? They really want to help.
They really do.
The problem is they're kind of like taught in a system where they're super stressed and they don't really know how to help in a way that's actually advantageous to the patient in a sense.
Interestingly, you got it pretty good. What I've noticed is that they're frustrated with the constraints put on them. They're frustrated with the fact that they have to follow algorithms. In other words, they have to follow a certain algorithm and make a diagnosis and have a pharmaceutical treatment path that you really can't deviate much from. Okay. And it used to be suggestions, but now those paths are standards of care. What that means is that when you deviate from a standard of care, you're committing malpractice. It's terrible because doctors who are very well trained and really want to help are not allowed to be doctors and utilize their training, utilize their intelligence. And then they run into loads of patients who, despite their best efforts, aren't getting better. They call them the nightmare patients. The person who's walking up the walkway, they see him and they want to lock the doors and run out the back. Okay, because it's not that they don't care, it's just that they're frustrated as heck. They don't know what else to do. They're not stupid. They've been trained a certain way. They've been exposed to stuff a certain way. And what I do, that I've explained, is looking at things from a very different point of view. Okay, it's not a matter of just having nutritional knowledge. It's a matter of having to put things together. When I say holistic fashion, I mean, I'm talking about looking at the whole person rather than looking at the person in parts. Okay. So when you're that frustrated, okay, after a while you get tired, and seemingly you don't care. Okay. Because just like, I don't know what else is wrong when they send you to a psychiatrist, must be in your head. Okay. When there's other things that could be done. It's sad. It really is. But I've been very blessed to be able to take up the slack.
Yeah. It's good to know that because there is another way, right? We just kind of have to step out of our current paradigm to actually look at what works for people, right? And then there's certain doctors that do that, like you, right? And then you just kind of realize that, hey, these people don't have to be managed their whole life. They can actually get to the root of the cause and
Right.
have a sense of empowerment in their lives too.
That is the big deal.
Yeah.
When you have a chronic illness, you're essentially being told, and you make a very good point, Anthony. You're essentially being told that you have something you have no control over, and I will help you manage it, but something has its grip on you. Well, not necessarily. If you change that around and you realize there's other stuff that can be done, you regain your own power. You can regain your own control over it. And believe it or not, I like to look at disease as a bully. You either punch it in the nose or you laugh at it. Okay. But the best way to go after chronic illness is knowledge. That, and you first have to accept the fact that this is not my lot in life. It's sort of like the genetics, and everybody looks at MTHFR. I get nuts because it's one enzyme in a long pathway, and they look at two genes when there's 50 variations. Okay. So the importance of that particular issue, which is not an issue, has been blown out of proportion. And you have to look at the pathways rather than just the single gene. Nevertheless, it's all, and then it gets into a big mishmash of who knows what stage they're in their understanding, what the contribution of this, that, and the other thing are to the total condition. It's not an easy thing to do, but I know my medical colleagues are very, very frustrated, especially being in those time constraints. So everything else they need to do, vital signs, taking a history, is relegated to what they call physician extenders. And they're good. Some people use medical assistants, which is, I think is horrible, because if you're going to have an interview, if somebody's going to go over your history, it better be a medical professional, because there's aspects that say, okay, this means that, this means that, this means that, not just looking at that form that you fill out before seeing the doctor, which is barely looked at. Okay. So it really should be the physician doing it, but they're constrained in time, and they can barely get through the chief complaints, much less the causations and so forth. It's I see their frustration, and I understand their frustration. I really do.
Yeah. We get caught up in the minutia of things. Like we focus on these, particular markers or whatnot, but we don't actually look beyond that in a sense, right? We kind of get caught up in this worry and whatnot. But essentially, if we look at things from a holistic perspective, like you do, we can realize that everything works in synergy, right? There's nothing that is isolated within the body. So we actually start to work on these different pillars of nutrition, sleep, exercise, stress management, all these things, they work together. And there's no one size approach to healing either, right? What is your personalized path while working on foundational principles too?
It's true. That's why what I've been pushing is individualized medicine. And it comes by a bunch of different names. But the fact is that the system, the way it is now, is you have this set of diagnoses, and you have to fit people into the diagnosis. Whereas we should be taking our knowledge and twisting it into their particular bioindividuality. It's the same thing in genetics. You can look at these pathways and say, oh, this is what, you'll be like. And it's not true, by the way. But the way it expresses is different for everybody. You're a supreme individual. And the rigid system that's people being forced into makes it difficult for the doctor because they have to fit you into this particular diagnostic code. And once you do that, you have a certain pharmaceutical protocol that must be followed. The days of you walking into your doctor's office with a normal thyroid test and you're wearing a sweater, or if you're in England, a jumper, okay, in 95-degree weather, and you're losing your hair and you can't, and you're gaining weight for no reason, which are all the signs of hypothyroidism. And you would go to your GP in the 60s and they would say, well, I'll use this test for toilet paper later, but they would start treating you. Now, unless the test proves it, they're not allowed to treat it. And there's a real long time that you can have subclinical hypothyroidism, low thyroid, before it shows up on a lab test. And those symptoms can include fatigue, fibromyalgia, weakness, again, weight problems, losing your hair, having temperature dysregulation, that they'll assign to almost anything else. But because the test has to show it, and those tests aren't nearly as accurate as you think. Okay, they have to be interpreted. Okay, and they usually test what they're testing for, but you have to extrapolate the information from it. You can't just say, "Oh, it's normal." It's not normal, not necessarily. By the way, a little hint for you. Those normal ranges or averages? If your number, what you do is you divide that into thirds. This is for most things. You divide it into thirds. If your number is in the middle third, good. If your number is in the lower third, that's suboptimal. If your number is in the upper third, it requires interpretation. Just a rule of thumb.
Awesome. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense because we definitely don't want to be below normal, but necessarily normal is not optimal, right? Because we want to actually be optimizing our overall wellness too. So just keeping that top of mind is a good point there.
And there's a lot of great tests you can have out there. There's a lot of companies that will give you these extensive tests, that it's great. It's great to do that, but you can't take the word of the company when they start writing everything out as that's gospel. Okay, you need to work with somebody who can interpret the tests. One of my favorite jokes is, be careful what tests you order. You might have to interpret them. Okay, because reading a test and interpretation are two different things. Okay, I'm a functional medicine practitioner. That's what you would call my profession. I'm going to give you a little hint. In picking out a functional medicine practitioner, okay, if that person wants you to have $2,000 or $3,000 worth of tests before you even see them, walk away. That's not somebody who cares about you. That's somebody who wants you to spend money on tests. So now you're curious, and then they will enter you into these ridiculous treatment programs. It's a practice management technique. It's not a true way of treating somebody. What they should do is do a history, look at your prior tests, and correlate them and find out what stones have been left unturned. And if you need to do tests, that's what you base them on. They should be targeted. So be careful. Yeah. Plus, they're hellishly expensive.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right, Dr. Jess, this has been awesome. I really appreciate you today for coming on the show, sharing all your knowledge, your insights, and your story, because there's so much to chronic disease, so much things we have to cover in order to actually get to the root of the issue, right? And a lot of times, like, if we come up with this conventional paradigm, drugs to everything, it's not going to be a route to healing, right? I mean, everything has its place, but ultimately, what are the actions that we need to take so we can have agency and power over our own lives and over our own health, right? So thanks so much, man. It's been an honor.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah. So if we can get connected with you and all your work, where can we go for that?
Very simply, it's easy to find me, Dr. Jess Armine, DRJSSARMINE. I'll give Anthony my social media stuff. If you go to my website and you're curious whether I can help you or not, on the bottom of the page, you'll see this little button that says Get Acquainted, which will allow you to schedule a 30-minute free conference where we do there is just chat about what's going on. I answer as many questions as I can, but the true purpose of that is for me to look at you and say, yes, I can help you. No, I can't. Okay, because that makes me comfortable, and to see if we click as people. Okay. My YouTube channel is Dr. Jess Armine, DR again. And I've done a ton of videos over the years, and lots of information there. My Instagram channel is Dr. Jess Armine 724, which is my birthday, and a lot of my podcasts and stuff are there. So yeah, there's lots of information out there that, I think might be beneficial for you.
Awesome. Thank you so much.